A black executive boards her flight after securing a hard-earned VIP seat. Ready to relax after years of relentless dedication. But moments after sitting down, a flight attendant demands she move to accommodate a white passenger. What happens next shatters the silence around systemic racism in the travel industry and sparks a movement no one expected. Stay with me. This story is one you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to share it. It started as an ordinary flight. The airport buzzed with its usual early morning energy. A blur of wheels on polished tiles, muffled announcements, and the occasional laugh breaking the monotony of travelers trudging toward their gates. Eliza Patterson stood apart from the crowd. Not physically, but in the way she carried herself. There was a quiet dignity in her stride. The kind that came from years of navigating spaces where her presence was often questioned. Her worth silently doubted. Her first-class ticket wasn't just a slip of paper, it was a testament to her labor. Late nights spent managing 2 jobs, careful savings, and a recent promotion that seemed like a validation of everything she'd fought for. This trip was a small luxury, a moment of comfort she had earned. As she boarded the plane, her polished leather bag in hand, she caught a few fleeting glances from other passengers in the first-class cabin. Their expressions flickered with the questions she had grown accustomed to seeing. Does she belong here? Who is she? Eliza ignored them and slid into her assigned seat. 3A, by the window. She exhaled softly, adjusting her scarf and placing her bag neatly beneath the seat. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, its orange light spreading across the tarmac, promising a serene flight. She pulled out her book, hoping to lose herself in its pages until the plane took off. The moment of peace was interrupted by the arrival of a flight attendant. The woman leaned down slightly, her smile professional but tight. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her tone clipped in a way that made Eliza's stomach tighten. "We need to ask you to switch seats." Eliza looked up, surprised. "Why?" Her voice was calm, measured, though she could feel the tension beginning to coil in her chest. The attendant hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "We have another passenger who needs this seat." Eliza frowned, clutching her boarding pass. "I'm sorry, but this is the seat I paid for. There must be some mistake." The attendant's smile faltered, and her voice lowered. "It's just a matter of convenience. We hope you'll cooperate." Convenience. The word landed heavily, weighted with implication. Eliza glanced across the aisle and saw the other passenger. A white man in a crisp suit. Standing just far enough away to appear aloof but close enough to make his presence known. He avoided her gaze, staring instead at the seat she occupied, as though willing her to disappear. "No," Eliza said firmly, "I'm not moving." The attendant straightened, clearly taken aback. "Ma'am, we're just asking for a small favor." "And I'm refusing," Eliza replied, her tone steady but sharp. "This isn't a favor, it's my seat. I paid for it, and I intend to stay here." Around her, the quiet murmur of other passengers began to swell. People shifted in their seats, some glancing her way, others avoiding eye contact. She could feel their unease, the weight of their judgment pressing down like an invisible hand. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted, deep and authoritative. It was the man in the suit. He stepped forward, his face flushed with barely concealed irritation. "This is absurd," he said, addressing the attendant but clearly speaking for the benefit of the entire cabin. "It's just a seat. She should cooperate." Eliza turned to him, her expression calm but unyielding. "If it's just a seat, then why don't you take the one you were assigned?" The man's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Before he could respond, the attendant spoke again. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to escalate this if you refuse to cooperate." "Please do," Eliza replied. Her heart was pounding now, but she refused to let it show. Years of practice had taught her how to mask the fear, the anger, the exhaustion. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." The murmurs around her grew louder, and Eliza could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in. Some passengers seemed supportive. A middle-aged woman a few rows back offered her a small nod of encouragement. But others were visibly annoyed. A man muttered something about delays. Shaking his head, Eliza gripped the armrests of her seat. her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about the quiet indignities she had endured her entire life. The countless times she had been asked, told, to move, to wait, to prove herself. She wouldn't yield. Not this time. As the attendant disappeared down the aisle, presumably to fetch her supervisor, Eliza leaned back and exhaled. The battle had just begun, and she knew the road ahead would be fraught with tension. But she had decided, in that moment, that she would not be erased. Outside the window, the sun climbed higher, its light spilling into the cabin, illuminating the faces of the passengers who now watched her with varying degrees of curiosity, discomfort, and judgment. Eliza met their gazes without flinching, her silence speaking louder than any words could. For now, she would wait. The lounge was filled with the soft clatter of ceramic cups and the low murmur of voices. A symphony of civility masking the subtle hierarchies within. Eliza had chosen a corner seat, her back to the wall, where she could observe the movements of the room. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea as she leafed through a travel magazine she wasn't reading. The week had been long, and the flight ahead promised the only semblance of stillness she would have for days. Yet, even in this brief reprieve, she couldn't shake the unease that followed her like a shadow. It wasn't the stars, though they were there, faint glances that flickered across her like whispers. It was the way the air seemed to shift around her, charged with an unspoken question. What are you doing here? A man in a tailored navy suit walked past her table, his cologne leaving a faint trace of cedarwood in the air. He didn't look at her directly, but she caught the way his gaze lingered on the edge of her table, as though her presence upset the balance of the room. It wasn't blatant, not an outright confrontation, but it was enough to stir something in her chest. She had seen that look before. At country clubs, in corporate elevators, in luxury boutiques where she was met with polite smiles that always seemed too quick to fade. The lounge attendant approached, her smile practiced, her posture deferential. Ma'am, she said, her voice soft but pointed. Would you like a refill? Eliza nodded, grateful for the interruption. As the attendant moved to refill her cup, the man in the navy suit stopped by the counter, gesturing to the attendant with a snap of his fingers. Excuse me, he said, his tone brisk. Can you help me with the Wi-Fi? I can't seem to connect. The attendant hesitated, her eyes darting between Eliza and the man. Of course, sir, she said, abandoning the teapot mid-pour and moving swiftly to assist him. Eliza watched the exchange unfold, the subtle shift in the attendant's demeanor as she catered to his request. Her own cup left half-filled. It was a small thing, a moment that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. But to Eliza, it was a familiar refrain. She set the cup down and stood, smoothing the hem of her blouse. The flight would begin boarding soon, and she wanted to be among the first to settle into her seat. As she made her way to the gate, she felt the weight of the man's gaze follow her, a silent reminder of the unspoken hierarchies that lingered in spaces like these. At the gate, the tension was palpable. The line for first-class passengers was short. A collection of finely tailored suits, designer luggage, and faces marked by a certain air of entitlement. Eliza stepped into the queue, her boarding pass in hand, and felt the faint stir of unease rise again. Ahead of her, an older couple whispered to one another, their voices low but not low enough. I didn't realize they'd expanded first class this much, the woman said, her eyes flicking toward Eliza. The man nodded, a quiet hum of agreement passing between them. Eliza's grip tightened on her boarding pass, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. She didn't respond. There was no need. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Not when the war was ongoing and endless. The gate agent scanned her pass without comment, though her eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced at the seat number. Eliza held her head high, meeting the gaze of the agent with a quiet defiance that said, I belong here. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was an oasis of subdued lighting and plush leather seats, a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal. Eliza found her seat, 2A, and began to settle in, stowing her bag in the overhead compartment and slipping off her blazer. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to let the tension seep out of her shoulders. But the peace was short-lived. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted. Eliza turned to see a flight attendant standing beside her, a clipboard in hand and a strained smile on her face. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, but we may need you to switch seats." The words hit her like a jolt, her heart sinking even as her mind raced to process the request. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There must be some mistake. This is my seat." The flight attendant's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of discomfort. "I understand, ma'am, but there's another passenger who requires this seat. We'd like to ask for your cooperation." Cooperation. The word rang in her ears like a bell, sharp and insistent. Eliza took a slow breath, her gaze steady as she replied, "I'm happy to cooperate if there's a legitimate reason. Otherwise, I'll be staying in the seat I paid for." The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes darting to the man standing a few feet away, a white man in a crisp button-down shirt, his expression impatient. He didn't speak, but his presence was loud enough. Eliza knew what this was, even if no one said it outright. It wasn't about logistics or necessity. It was about something much older, much uglier. "I see," the flight attendant said finally, her tone clipped. "Let me speak with my supervisor." As she walked away, Eliza leaned back in her seat, her heart pounding. Around her, passengers watched with varying degrees of interest, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disapproval. She met their gazes head-on, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. This was not the first time she had been asked to move, to make herself smaller, to make way for someone deemed more deserving. But today, she decided, it would be the last. The cabin settled into a tentative stillness, the kind that follows when a situation begins to simmer but hasn't yet reached a boil. Eliza could feel it pressing on her from all sides. The unspoken judgments, the quiet shifting of bodies in seats, and the occasional glance that lingered just long enough to be noticed. She reminded herself to breathe, to remain calm, though her pulse thudded against her ribs like a warning. The flight attendant hadn't returned yet, but Eliza knew she would. These situations always had a way of escalating, not because of the initial request, but because of what followed. The insinuations, the subtle attempts to make her feel unreasonable, and the uncomfortable, silent complicity of everyone watching. The man who had prompted the ordeal, the entitled passenger with his crisp button-down and air of impatience, was standing a few feet away, pretending not to be involved. He thumbed through his phone, avoiding her gaze, but his posture radiated irritation. He had made his desires clear simply by existing in that space. He wanted her seat, and he was used to getting what he wanted. Eliza felt her grip tighten on the armrest as the minutes crawled by. A voice broke the silence, low and cautious. "You're handling this well." She turned to see the woman across the aisle, her hair silvered with age, her eyes sharp with something akin to admiration. The woman leaned in slightly, her voice lowered to avoid being overheard. "Most people would have moved by now." Eliza gave a faint, tired smile. "Most people don't have to fight to stay where they belong." The woman nodded, her expression softening. "No, they don't." It was a small exchange, but it steadied Eliza in ways she hadn't expected. Someone understood. Someone saw her, even if the understanding was incomplete. Still, she knew better than to expect solidarity from the rest of the cabin. The quiet murmurs she caught from other passengers hinted at annoyance, not at the situation itself but at her refusal to comply. "She's holding up the whole flight," a man muttered from a few rows back, his words just loud enough to carry. Eliza didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. She had heard that tone before. The impatient exasperation of someone who resented her for disrupting the illusion of seamless luxury. It didn't matter that she was in the right. To him, she was an inconvenience. When the flight attendant returned, she wasn't alone. A supervisor followed in her wake, his expression carefully neutral but his posture rigid. He introduced himself with a clipped politeness that only heightened the tension. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he began. "I understand there's been some confusion about your seat." "There's no confusion," Eliza replied evenly. "This is my seat, and I've made it clear I won't be moving." The supervisor's smile tightened, his gaze flicking briefly to the passenger standing nearby. We're simply trying to accommodate everyone's needs, he said, his tone measured. This other passenger has a pressing connection. And we thought, quote, that I should inconvenience myself to accommodate him? Eliza interrupted, her voice calm but firm. I upgraded to this seat for a reason. If his connection is so pressing, perhaps he should have planned better. The words landed heavily in the cabin, eliciting a quiet gasp from someone nearby. The supervisor's expression faltered for a moment, the practiced professionalism slipping just enough to reveal his irritation. Ma'am, he said, his tone cooling, we're asking for your cooperation. And I've said no, Eliza replied, leaning forward slightly. If there's a policy that allows you to reassign my seat without cause, I'd like to see it. Otherwise, I suggest we end this conversation. The supervisor hesitated, clearly unprepared for her resistance. He glanced at the flight attendant, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Around them, the murmurs grew louder, a mix of disbelief and disapproval rippling through the cabin. This is ridiculous, the entitled passenger finally snapped, his voice cutting through the tension. I'm not waiting here all day because she wants to make a scene. Eliza turned to face him, her gaze steady. I'm not making a scene, she said quietly. I'm protecting my dignity. There's a difference. The silence that followed was deafening. The other passengers, who had been content to watch passively, now seemed to struggle with where to place their allegiances. The man's outburst had drawn attention not just to his entitlement, but to the stark reality of what was unfolding. A moment of quiet but undeniable discrimination, laid bare for all to see. It was the silver-haired woman who broke the silence again. She's absolutely right, she said, her voice firm. If the roles were reversed, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Her words sent a ripple through the cabin. A younger man a few rows back chimed in, his voice loud and clear. She paid for her seat, just like everyone else. Let her stay where she is. For the first time, Eliza felt the tide begin to shift. The supervisor glanced around, clearly noting the change in the cabin's atmosphere. His professionalism began to falter under the weight of the scrutiny. I'll need to consult with the captain, he said finally, his voice clipped. Please remain seated while we resolve this matter. As he walked away, Eliza exhaled slowly, her grip on the armrest loosening. She knew this wasn't over. Not yet, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. The tide was turning, and with it, the possibility of something greater than a single victory. This wasn't just about her seat anymore. It was about being seen, being heard, and refusing to disappear. The cabin hummed with uneasy energy, a tension thick enough to settle into the fabric of the seats and the recycled air. The supervisor's departure had left a void, one quickly filled by whispers and sidelong glances. Eliza sat motionless, her fingers laced together tightly in her lap. The silence around her was heavy, almost accusatory, but she held her ground, aware of the many eyes trained on her from every angle. The entitled passenger had taken a seat in a nearby row, his movements abrupt and indignant. He muttered something under his breath as he scrolled on his phone, his frustration spilling over like a cracked dam. Unbelievable, he spat, not bothering to lower his voice. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, aimed not just at Eliza but at anyone who dared to acknowledge her stand. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. This wasn't the first time she'd been here. Not in this exact scenario, but in a space where her existence was called into question, her presence treated as something to be justified. It was an old, familiar battle, fought in conference rooms, grocery store aisles, and even suburban sidewalks where neighbors had asked, "Do you live here?" This was just the latest iteration of the same exhausting war. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman who had spoken up earlier gave her a subtle nod, her expression one of quiet solidarity. It was a small gesture, but it steadied Eliza. It reminded her that not everyone in the room was against her, even if most chose silence. Minutes passed, long and agonizing. When the supervisor returned, his expression was a mix of weariness and determination. Behind him trailed a younger flight attendant, who seemed reluctant to be involved but carried an air of duty nonetheless. The cabin's quiet murmur stilled as they approached Eliza's seat. "Ma'am," the supervisor began, his voice stiff, After consulting with the captain, we've decided that we will not require you to move. However, he paused, and his gaze darkened slightly. We expect all passengers to maintain decorum for the remainder of the flight. The implication was clear. Eliza hadn't caused the problem, but she was being held responsible for it nonetheless. She knew this tactic well. Frame the victim as the disruptor, the troublemaker, the reason for everyone else's discomfort. It was a sleight of hand designed to shift blame and deflect accountability. Decorum works both ways, Eliza replied calmly, refusing to let her voice rise or falter. I trust that applies to everyone on board. Her words were met with an awkward silence, and the supervisor's lips pressed into a thin line. He gave a curt nod before retreating down the aisle, the younger flight attendant following in his wake. The entitled passenger let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to draw more attention. All this fuss for nothing, he muttered, his tone dripping with contempt. Some people just like to play the victim. The comment sparked a murmur of reactions throughout the cabin. Some passengers averted their gazes, unwilling to get involved. Others exchanged looks that ranged from sympathy to discomfort, their internal debates playing out silently on their faces. The younger man who had supported Eliza earlier leaned forward in his seat, ready to respond, but she raised a hand to stop him. It's fine, she said softly, though the words felt like sandpaper in her throat. It wasn't fine, not even close, but she didn't want this to escalate further. Not here, not now. As the flight finally prepared for takeoff, Eliza settled back into her seat, though the tension in her shoulders remained. She opened the book she'd brought with her, flipping to a random page to appear engrossed. But the words blurred together as her mind replayed the events of the last hour. This wasn't just about a seat, she reminded herself. It never had been. This was about how easily some people wielded their entitlement, how systems were designed to uphold it, and how standing against it came at a cost. The cost wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it lingered, showing up in the form of second glances and coded language, in the quiet but unmistakable judgments of those who decided she was difficult or disruptive. It showed up in the isolation of moments like this, where even those who agreed with her chose silence because speaking out was inconvenient. Midway through the flight, the silver-haired woman leaned across the aisle, her voice low but firm. You did the right thing, she said, even if most of them won't admit it. Eliza turned to her, meeting her gaze. Sometimes it feels like the right thing doesn't matter unless everyone agrees. The woman smiled faintly. That's what they want you to believe. But it matters. Trust me, it matters. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. That even in the face of quiet opposition, there was power in standing firm. And maybe, just maybe, that power would ripple outward, challenging not just the man who demanded her seat, but the entire framework that made him think he could. Eliza disembarked from the flight feeling a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The cabin's subdued murmurs and the lingering tension between passengers clung to her like static electricity. She walked through the terminal, her mind replaying the events with a clinical detachment, as if scrutinizing the mechanics of a machine that was designed to fail her. At the baggage carousel, Eliza retrieved her luggage and made her way to a quiet corner of the airport. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails and notifications, her thumb hovering over the contact list. She considered letting the incident go, an option she knew would be the easiest path forward. But the memory of the entitled man's smirk made her stomach tighten. With a deep breath, she made a decision. She dialed the airline's customer service line, already bracing for the canned responses she knew were coming. The representative's voice was bright and rehearsed, her words dripping with professional detachment. Thank you for calling Sky Vista Airlines. How can I assist you today? Eliza explained the situation calmly but firmly, detailing the encounter without exaggeration. I want to know why I was singled out, she said, her voice steady, and I'd like a direct response from someone in authority. The representative hesitated, her tone faltering slightly. I'm sorry to hear about your experience. Ma'am, I'll file a report and ensure it's escalated to the appropriate department. That's not enough, Eliza replied. her frustration seeping into her words despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I don't want this buried in a report. I want accountability." The representative's response was noncommittal. But Eliza pressed on. Before ending the call, she noted the reference number for her complaint and requested an email confirmation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Eliza spent the evening drafting a social media post. She had no intention of sensationalizing the incident. But she knew the power of visibility. The post was concise, recounting the events with clarity and ending with a pointed question. "Why does this keep happening?" She hesitated before hitting post, unsure of whether she was prepared for the backlash that often accompanied public calls for accountability. But the thought of staying silent felt heavier than the risk of speaking out. Within hours, her story began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. The hashtags #FlyingWhileBlack and #Seat of Privilege began trending, amplifying her experience beyond the confines of her own network. Eliza was surprised to find that her story resonated far beyond her expectations. People shared their own encounters with bias and discrimination, their voices forming a collective narrative of exclusion and resilience. Yet, amidst the solidarity, there were reminders of the uphill battle she faced. Dismissive remarks questioning her version of events, accusations of playing the victim, and thinly veiled hostility from strangers who had no stake in the matter. The next morning, Eliza received a call from a representative in the airline's corporate office. The woman's voice was polished and practiced, her words carefully measured. "We've reviewed your complaint, Ms. Davis," she began. "First, let me apologize on behalf of Sky Vista Airlines. We take these matters very seriously, and we're committed to ensuring every passenger feels respected." Eliza listened, her expression neutral. She'd heard these scripts before. The woman continued, offering vague assurances about an internal review and promises of additional training for staff. It was exactly what Eliza had expected, a non-apology cloaked in corporate jargon. "That's not sufficient," Eliza said firmly. "I want to know what actions are being taken to address the root of the problem, not just the surface-level symptoms." The representative faltered, clearly unprepared for such directness. "We're still in the early stages of our review," she replied, "but I assure you, we're treating this with the utmost priority." Eliza hung up the call with a sense of grim determination. If the airline wouldn't take meaningful action, she would push harder. Over the next few days, the story continued to spread. Media outlets picked up the narrative, framing it as part of a larger conversation about systemic bias in the travel industry. Advocacy groups reached out, offering support and resources to help Eliza navigate the public fallout. Meanwhile, the airline faced mounting pressure to respond more transparently. But with the visibility came backlash. Online trolls questioned her motives, accusing her of seeking attention or exaggerating the incident. "Why didn't you just move?" one commenter wrote, the words dripping with condescension. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." Eliza reminded herself that the resistance was inevitable. Systems of power didn't crumble easily, and those who benefited from them often fought hardest to preserve the status quo. By the end of the week, the airline released a public statement. It was an attempt at damage control, promising a comprehensive review of its policies and mandatory bias training for all staff. But the statement stopped short of acknowledging the deeper issues at play, framing the incident as an isolated misunderstanding rather than a symptom of systemic inequity. Eliza wasn't satisfied. She drafted an op-ed for a major news outlet, outlining the broader implications of her experience and calling for industry-wide reforms. She didn't want this to end with a hollow apology. She wanted change. As she typed the final words of her piece, Eliza felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about her or her seat on that flight. It was about the countless others who had faced similar indignities in silence, their experiences dismissed or ignored. It was about dismantling the invisible hierarchies that dictated who belonged and who didn't. Her fight was far from over, but she was ready to face the challenges ahead. For Eliza, this wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a testament to the power of persistence. The refusal to accept a world that demanded she shrink herself to make others comfortable. The public storm Eliza ignited had not abated, if anything. It had only grown fiercer. As the days passed, her story took on a life of its own, sparking conversations in boardrooms, break rooms, and kitchens across the country. Yet, with every ripple of support, there came an undercurrent of resistance. A steady pushback from those who refused to see the world as it was, clinging instead to their illusions of fairness. Eliza sat at her desk late one evening, her apartment dim except for the glow of her laptop. Notifications pinged relentlessly as messages poured in. Emails from reporters requesting interviews. Comments on her social media posts ranging from heartfelt to vitriolic. And threads of support from advocacy groups eager to amplify her story. But there were other messages, too, ones she hadn't been prepared for. Thinly veiled threats, accusations of dishonesty, and dismissive comments that framed her experience as trivial or exaggerated. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of hostility. But it didn't make it any less exhausting. The weight of it pressed down on her, a constant reminder of how deeply the roots of prejudice ran. Yet, even as doubt crept in, Eliza knew she couldn't afford to back down. This fight was bigger than her. Meanwhile, at Sky Vista Airlines, the internal investigation was underway, though it was clear the company's primary concern was managing its public image. The executives were scrambling, holding emergency meetings with public relations consultants and legal advisors. On the surface, they projected an air of cooperation. But behind closed doors, their tone was far more defensive. "This is getting out of hand," one executive muttered, scrolling through a flood of angry tweets. "She's making us look like villains. She's making us accountable," another retorted, though his voice lacked conviction. The room fell silent as the CEO, a man with a reputation for prioritizing profits over principles, leaned forward. "We need to control the narrative," he said. "This isn't about systemic issues, it's about one incident. Keep it contained." Their strategy became clear the next morning when Sky Vista released a carefully worded statement. It framed the incident as an isolated misunderstanding, pledging to address concerns through enhanced training and improved communication. But there was no mention of the deeper biases at play, no acknowledgement of the systemic inequities that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Eliza read the statement twice, her jaw tightening. It was exactly what she had expected, an attempt to placate without taking real responsibility. She drafted a response on her blog, dismantling the airline's narrative with precision. "This isn't about a single flight or a single seat," she wrote. "It's about a pattern of exclusion that permeates every layer of our society. From the skies to the streets. If Sky Vista wants to regain the trust of its passengers, it needs to do more than issue hollow promises. It needs to confront the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place." Her words resonated, and the post went viral within hours. But with visibility came more resistance. Eliza's name became a flashpoint. Her story debated on talk shows and dissected in opinion pieces. Some praised her courage, while others dismissed her as a troublemaker. The backlash was swift and ugly, fueled by the same biases she had been fighting against. She was labeled angry, entitled, and ungrateful. The words echoing the centuries-old stereotypes used to discredit black women who dared to demand better. Amidst the chaos, Eliza found allies in unexpected places. A coalition of civil rights organizations reached out, offering legal support and a platform to amplify her voice. Fellow travelers shared their own stories of bias and mistreatment, their experiences weaving a tapestry of exclusion that was impossible to ignore. Advocacy groups launched petitions demanding accountability from Sky Vista, while journalists dug into the airline's history, uncovering patterns of discriminatory practices that stretched back decades. But even as her support grew, so did the pressure. Eliza began receiving calls from anonymous numbers, the voices on the other end dripping with thinly veiled threats. Her email inbox overflowed with messages, some urging her to keep fighting, others warning her to back down. She changed her passwords, tightened her security settings, and kept a wary eye on her surroundings. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at her edges, she refused to be silenced. The breaking point came during a live television interview. Eliza had agreed to appear on a morning talk show to discuss the broader implications of her experience. But the segment quickly turned combative. One of the hosts, a man whose cheerful demeanor barely concealed his skepticism, leaned forward and asked, "Don't you think you're overreacting? After all, it's just a seat." Eliza's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "It's never just a seat," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about the assumptions that the seat represents. The assumption that someone like me doesn't belong in spaces of privilege. The assumption that my comfort and dignity are negotiable. Those assumptions don't stay on a plane. They follow us into every aspect of our lives." Her words hung in the air. And for a moment, the host looked taken aback. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the studio audience's scattered applause. Eliza left the interview feeling both drained and vindicated. She had spoken her truth. And whether or not everyone was ready to hear it, she knew it mattered. That night, as Eliza scrolled through messages of support and criticism, she found herself reflecting on the week's events. The fight had been harder than she'd anticipated, and the cost had been higher. But as she read the stories of others who had been inspired by her stand, she realized she was part of something larger. This wasn't just her battle. It was a collective reckoning. A demand for a world that recognized the humanity of everyone, not just the privileged few. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would only grow. But Eliza was ready. She had faced the storm, and though it had tried to break her, she had emerged stronger, her resolve unshaken. This was a fight worth having. Not just for herself, but for all those who had been told to shrink, to disappear, to accept less. And she would not stop until the skies and the world belonged to everyone. Eliza stood on the steps of a courthouse in Atlanta, the city's humid air heavy with the weight of expectations. Before her, a sea of reporters and supporters gathered, their voices a low hum of anticipation. The backdrop of the courthouse, with its towering columns and austere facade, felt like a fitting metaphor for the struggle, a system as rigid as stone, resistant to change, yet vulnerable to the steady erosion of time and truth. The airline had not only refused to address her concerns adequately but had also subtly suggested that her story was exaggerated. Miscommunication was their favorite term, a word that simultaneously dismissed her experience and absolved them of accountability. But Eliza knew this wasn't about miscommunication. It was about a culture that thrived on silent complicity. The night before, she had barely slept. The thought of taking her fight to court was daunting. But the alternative, a quiet surrender, felt unbearable. As her attorney outlined the next steps over coffee that morning, Eliza nodded along, not trusting herself to speak. The stakes had grown higher. And with each passing day, the weight of her decision pressed harder against her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was starkly different. The echoes of shuffled papers and murmured conversations underscored the gravity of the moment. Eliza sat at the plaintiff's table, her attorney at her side, flipping through documents and conferring with their legal team. Across the room, the airline's lawyers exuded a cold confidence, their polished appearances a testament to their firm's reputation for burying cases like this in technicalities. As the proceedings began, Eliza found herself acutely aware of the tension that buzzed beneath the surface. Every question, every objection, every piece of evidence introduced felt like a carefully orchestrated battle. The airline's representatives leaned heavily on their narrative of an unfortunate misunderstanding, painting Eliza's reaction as overly emotional and disproportionate. It was the oldest trick in the book, and Eliza recognized it for what it was, an attempt to diminish her, to frame her as unreasonable, to question her very right to speak. But she refused to let their tactics shake her. When the time came for her to testify, she rose from her seat with quiet determination. Facing the courtroom, she spoke with the clarity and conviction that had carried her through every challenge since that fateful flight. "This isn't just about a seat," she said, her voice steady. "It's about a pattern of assumptions and biases that undermine people like me every single day. It's about the moments we're asked to move, to wait, to prove we belong. Moments that might seem small to some but are deeply significant to those of us who have lived them over and over again." Her words hung in the air, the silence in the room a testament to their impact. Even the airline's lawyers seemed momentarily taken aback. their practiced expressions faltering for just a moment. Outside the courthouse, the response was immediate. News outlets ran headlines dissecting her testimony, while social media buzzed with clips of her speech. Some lauded her courage, while others doubled down on their criticisms, accusing her of seeking attention or trying to profit from the situation. Eliza tried not to let the negativity affect her, but she couldn't entirely shake the sting of it. She thought of her grandmother, who had once sat her down and told her about the civil rights marches of the 1960s. Progress is slow, her grandmother had said, her voice soft but firm. But every step forward matters, no matter how small it might feel at the moment. Eliza clung to those words as the weeks dragged on. The case became a flashpoint in the national conversation about race and privilege. And as the spotlight intensified, so did the pressure. The airline doubled down on its defense, releasing statements that framed the incident as an anomaly rather than part of a broader pattern. Advocacy groups rallied around Eliza, but the backlash from detractors grew louder, threatening to drown out the voices of support. Then, something shifted. An internal whistleblower came forward, a former employee of the airline who provided damning evidence of systemic issues within the company. Emails and training documents surfaced, revealing a culture that not only tolerated bias but, in some cases, perpetuated it. The revelations were a turning point, exposing the airline's polished facade for what it truly was. Suddenly, Eliza's fight wasn't just her own. It was a reckoning for the entire industry. Other employees came forward with their stories. Passengers recounted similar experiences, and the airline found itself scrambling to contain the fallout. Their legal team grew quieter, their confidence visibly shaken as the tide began to turn. Eliza watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and weariness. She had become the face of a movement she hadn't intended to start. And while the momentum was exhilarating, it was also exhausting. She missed the quiet of her pre-flight life, the simplicity of working hard and enjoying the fruits of her labor without the constant weight of scrutiny. But then she thought of the young woman who had approached her after a rally, tears in her eyes as she recounted her own experience of being told to move in a similar situation. "You gave me the courage to speak up," the woman had said. "I didn't think anyone would care, but you proved me wrong." Those moments reminded Eliza why she couldn't back down. Even when the road felt impossibly long, the system was shifting, however slowly, and every crack in its foundation was a victory worth fighting for. As she prepared for the next day in court, Eliza felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. This was bigger than her, bigger than any single flight or courtroom battle. It was about dismantling the invisible barriers that dictated who belonged and who didn't. One step at a time. The ground was shifting, and Eliza was determined to stand firm, no matter what came next. The courtroom was quieter now, the verdict delivered, and the echoes of the gavel still resonating in Eliza's mind. The airline had been found liable for discriminatory practices, and the judgment mandated sweeping policy reforms and restitution not just for Eliza but for others who had been similarly wronged. Yet, as she sat in the back of a cab on her way home, the weight of the fight settled heavily on her shoulders. Victory, as sweet as it was, felt tempered by the enormity of the task that still lay ahead. Her phone buzzed incessantly with congratulatory messages, requests for interviews, and notes of gratitude from strangers who had seen her stand as a beacon of courage. Among them was a message from a young man who had followed her case closely. "You don't know me," it read, "but your story gave me the strength to confront the bias I see at my workplace every day. Thank you for showing us how to speak up." Eliza set the phone down, staring out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. The fight wasn't just about her seat on a plane or even the policies of a single airline. It was about a pervasive system that had been left unchallenged for far too long. The judgment was a crack in the dam, but the flood that followed was uncertain. Weeks later, Eliza stood in a packed conference hall, the podium in front of her and rows of expectant faces before her. She had been invited to speak at a national summit on racial equity in corporate practices. Her case now a flashpoint for discussions on systemic change. Taking a deep breath, she began, "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a system that tells people of color, particularly black women, that we must always justify our presence, that we must fight for what others are granted without question. The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger. But let me be clear. This fight is not about vengeance. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that the next generation doesn't have to endure the same indignities that we have. It's about creating a world where dignity isn't something you have to demand. It's something you're given as a basic right. As she spoke, she could see the ripple effect her words created. Heads nodded in agreement, hands raised phones to record, and whispers of encouragement spread through the room. This wasn't just a speech. It was a rallying cry. The ripples from Eliza's fight extended far beyond the courtroom. The airline's case spurred a wave of internal reviews across industries, from hospitality to tech, as companies scrambled to avoid similar scrutiny. Advocacy groups used her story as a springboard to demand broader reforms. And even lawmakers took notice. A bill informally dubbed Eliza's Law was introduced, aimed at holding corporations accountable for discriminatory practices and establishing independent oversight mechanisms for customer complaints. Eliza herself became an unexpected leader in the movement. She formed a coalition with civil rights organizations and corporate allies, creating training programs and advocating for diversity and inclusion in spaces that had long resisted such efforts. Yet, the work was far from glamorous. It was grueling, slow, and often met with resistance. At times, Eliza felt the weight of the expectations placed upon her. She hadn't set out to become a symbol. She had only wanted to claim her rightful seat. But the momentum was undeniable. And stepping away now felt like abandoning a fight that had become bigger than her. One evening, she received an invitation to return to the airline. Not as a passenger but as a consultant. Their new leadership team wanted her to help design policies that would address the systemic issues exposed by her case. Eliza hesitated. Part of her wanted to decline, to leave the company behind as a chapter she'd rather not reopen. But another part of her knew that change often required stepping into uncomfortable spaces. The meeting was tense at first. The executives clearly unsure of how to engage with the woman whose lawsuit had shaken their foundation. But as Eliza laid out her vision, a comprehensive training program, transparent accountability measures, and a diverse leadership pipeline, she saw something shift. The skepticism gave way to genuine interest. And by the end of the session, the room buzzed with possibility. Months turned into a year, and Eliza's story became a case study in business schools and leadership seminars. Yet, for all the progress, the fight was far from over. She knew that systemic change was never linear. For every step forward, there would be pushback. For every victory, new challenges. Still, Eliza carried with her a deep sense of purpose. She thought of the young man who had messaged her, the countless others who had shared their own stories, and the faces of those who had stood by her in the courtroom. They were her reason for continuing, her reminder that every ripple had the potential to become a wave. Standing on the tarmac one evening, about to board a plane for another speaking engagement, Eliza paused. She looked up at the aircraft, its logo now bearing the tagline of the new initiative she had helped create. Every passenger, every seat, every right. It was a small gesture, but one that signaled a shift. A recognition that the fight for equality wasn't over but had truly begun. As the engines roared to life, Eliza settled into her seat, a quiet smile on her face. The journey was long, and the road ahead uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful, because change, she had learned, might be slow, but it was unstoppable.